Hello, welcome back to the Next Frontiers of AI, a podcast dedicated to exploring the insights, best practices, and real-world experiences of those shaping the future of AI. And that future may be here sooner than you think, as innovation cycles continue to move at warp speed. It has never been more important to stay informed, and we hope we are helping you stay one step ahead of the crowd. I'm Scott Hebner, your host, and thank you for tuning in. Today, we continue our discussions on how to turn agentic AI aspirations into outcomes. Last week, we discussed why it's never been a better time to be a startup or to start a new business using agentic AI, or as a company to use it to automate how work gets done. The nature of agentic AI has totally reset what is possible. AI is no longer about assisting people in executing tasks. It's about helping people get actual work done. Knowledge work, planning, thinking, making decisions, problem solving. We learned three key success factors from Hao-Yu Zhou, the CEO of a highly successful agentic AI startup named HOAI last week. He said, go deeply vertical, rethink what software is, and target labor spend, not IT spend. It's all about digital coworkers, not just digital assistants. The focus is on domain-specific digital labor. I thought it was excellent advice from a proven winner in the new agentic AI marketplace. Today, we take the next step with the help of an accomplished technologist and industry analyst in the AI space, George Gilbert. We'll delve into how AI agents are reshaping enterprise workflows, the technologies that enable them, and why this marks a fundamental shift in how software is designed, deployed, and evolved. Why architecture matters is what we're really going to focus on here, because it's more important than ever. George is the principal analyst here at theCUBE Research. I am sure many of you know him already. He focuses on data platforms, intelligent apps, and agentic frameworks. And just last week, in fact, he interviewed Marc, Benioff, the founder and CEO of Salesforce, on how software and labor markets will never be the same going forward because of the rise of agentic AI. If you haven't watched it, make sure you check it out, either on the AI Agent Builder Summit portal or go directly to YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it. It's a fascinating conversation. All right, so let's get started here. I'm thrilled to have George Gilbert. There he is. I brought him up. How you doing, George?
Hey, Scott. Good.
Weather good in California, I hope?
It is. We're seeing the first sort of parts of spring, at least after we hunkered down for the rainy season.
Yeah, it's finally like 75 degrees here outside New York.
Oh, wow. So, no, we're way behind that.
All right, let's dive into this. The thing that I'm most curious, let's start with, your takeaways after talking to Marc Benioff, which was just an absolutely fantastic interview. What did you learn? How does his views differ from what you've heard from dozens of other companies that you've engaged with?
So my biggest takeaway and the source of my interest in Salesforce is that agents are like a shiny object to everyone, and because it's a radically new technology that's transformative both on how we consume software and how we build software. But I think what's not part of the conversation always is that it's a systems problem. And that means that the performance of the agents is only as good as the data about the state of the business on which they're based, that they use, for inference, and their ability to operationalize their decisions. And that's why I thought so far of the incumbents, Salesforce is farthest ahead, because with their data cloud system of intelligence, Agentforce system of agency, and Customer 360 as their systems of record, it's all integrated into one piece. The customers still have to clean up their data, but you've got an all-in-one system that makes it much easier to get live than a do-it-yourself that only sort of tech companies are capable of.
Yeah, I mean, it was super interesting. He definitely has a vision for where this is all heading. I like his statement about how he may be the last CEO to be managing just human employees. I thought that was really, really interesting point of view.
One last thing that he mentioned that I thought was a great example was Disney. Like you can be walking through a theme park and your experience is impacted by, by the lines, and you don't know, you have to make either reservations or wait in long lines. And the one thing that I thought was interesting, he talked about an example where everyone in the park could have their own agent. I'm not sure whether this was live already, and the agent would be based on their preference, booking them rides based on the length of the lines, like optimizing the experience based on preference and availability. And that meant there were thousands of agents going around doing this for different people simultaneously. And that, you can't do if you're thinking about just a single agent.
Yeah, it's kind of like little tour guides helping the people have a better experience, and it knows everything
Exactly.
going on. And when he made that statement, it reminded me of what Abdi Guzari, who's the head of generative AI at Deloitte, said during the AI Agent Builder Summit, that he's starting to see their clients treating the chief AI officer as not obviously a technologist, but also a business person, but also as an HR person and responsible for managing the HR of digital workers.
Onboarding digital workers. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
That, yeah. I've heard of like Jensen Huang talks about the IT department being now the HR for digital labor, but the chief AI officer within that it's probably even more accurate.
Yeah. Well, look. So one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about is how agentic AI is truly a change from what we've been doing over the last 3 years with generative AI and AI assistants. Executing tasks and analyzing information and things of that nature, which everyone is pretty much familiar with. This is a whole new ball game that we're entering here, and I think that's why people like Marc Benioff and others are so excited about it. It's going to take a lot of new technologies that are emerging on the scene beyond just LLMs and generative AI. And one of the things I did, let me just bring this up so you can see it here and the audience can see it, is this is the aggregate of several surveys on the right on what are the most important new technologies that are going to be needed to build these agentic workflows, as time goes by here. And what is there, 7 of them or so here? I mean, GenAI and LLMs is obvious, very high relevancy, the highest by most of the rankings here. It's the foundation, right? But we get into things like vector databases and agentic RAG and these multi-agent communication protocols, and you need tool APIs, and you get into decision intelligence and learning loops. And this is a lot of new stuff that people are going to have to figure out, right? I mean, what's your view on this? It seems like there's a lot to work with. There's a lot you need to deal with now.
Well, it's sort of like when you put Gen AI, or the LLM at the top, that's just the thing that's responsible for essentially coming up with the control flow of a new application or a component of a new application, but you needed all those other components. The vector database was at least for, embeddings when you want to search and feed in chunks from your knowledge base. And that's itself just a first step, because that's like a fuzzy search. Like, so as you were talking about, like if you want semantic and causal reasoning, you actually need structured data, beyond what's in the vector database. You need the knowledge graph to show what's linked to what.
Right.
And an agentic RAG is like you might traverse the knowledge graph, look up some information, reflect on it, find you're missing something, and then make an additional plan and invoke some tools. And that's so part of agentic RAG. So
Yeah, it kind of builds. This is like it builds from top to bottom in some ways, right? You get the foundation of Gen AI and LLMs as the foundation, and then they're going to execute better and be more efficient with the vector databases versus the old relational and data warehouses. You got to do a lot of work with your data, and then, like you said, you get into RAG, and then you got to get these things to talk to each other and integrate with tools and ultimately make decisions, and the whole thing learns, right? But these are all. There was a lot of technologies mentioned, but these are the ones that had relevancy of, high relevancy. And that's a lot of technologies, for sure, right? I think.
And it goes back to the point right now, the way you have to integrate all these pieces. You either need to be a very sophisticated shop, or you need to buy from someone who's done the integration for you. So like the tech-centric born in the cloud companies might have the chops to do this, but most, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000s do not.
Right. And that's what's fueling this 47% compounded growth in agentic systems and agentic platforms. Let these companies help you build that foundation, then you focus on your added value on top of it. And that's where I think these technologies are going to start to show up. And I think we both agree, as we talked before the podcast, about architecture really matters, right?
Yeah.
You got to really think about this. I mean, this is the ultimate team sport in terms of how different technologies and different parts of an organization and different parts of your data set have to work together. And just like the theme park example you gave, it's not as simple as just rolling out a generative AI to somebody, right?
Right.
So,
and yeah, when you say architecture matters, that's back to the systems approach. It's sort of like, you don't build a complex, enterprise application because you wrote, one microservice. Like there's a lot more to it. And, agents, it's a little oversimplifying to say they're microservices that think, but they got to be part of a larger system.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. It's a componentized architecture, and these microservices now represent little workers that collaborate with each other and with humans to get stuff done. Really does change the ball game, and it also changes the nature of software in general, which is what the advice was last week. Was don't think about building how you would go about building a SaaS app. This is a totally new thing, right?
Right.
So let's dive. There's two particular areas of those technologies that I wanted to touch on a little bit with you. One that I kind of think over time will be the big differentiating components, if you will. One is the agentic RAG, which is coming on the scene now. And then the other is going to be the reasoning. So there's a little chart that I found out on the internet that kind of compares, a standalone LLM, traditional RAG, and then agentic RAG. What's your view of this whole thing that is, getting a lot of focus now? I mean, like you were saying before, it's able to navigate through a knowledge graph more effectively. It's able to do a lot of things that traditional RAG cannot do, right?
It's sort of, you think of it like an LLM has no external context or data. It's just you're asking it what questions about what's in the weights. The traditional RAG would be, like naively chunked vector embeddings, and that's essentially, the extent of its tool use is invoking the vector database, and you maybe have a re-ranker to say, what you pull out of the vector database, tell me what's most relevant first. But agentic RAG, then it adds so much more because, as the name implies, it can make a plan, it can retrieve data, reflect on what it's retrieved, decide has it answered, does it have all the information it needs, or based on what it's retrieved, figure out what additional steps it needs to do to find more information, invoke other tools. I mean, it's a huge leap forward in utility and the outcomes you can achieve.
Yeah, I think that was the notion. If you were looking carefully at the traditional RAG versus the agentic RAG, is exactly what you just said. The way I just read what you said, which it's much more dynamic. It can then choose what to do because it's planning, and it can integrate with more tools on the fly. You don't have to hard kind of code it all or structure it, right? It's a much more real-time dynamic decision on what to invoke and what to pull in terms of what's relevant, right? I mean, I think that's
That's
the
the way
notion.
you're saying the key word was what you said, the hard coded, because you're moving from putting all the control flow is in symbolic, code, to more and more is dynamically sort of planned and generated by the agent. That's more and more of the control flow of the application, or in this case, just this particular, task, it is generated and executed by the agent.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point before about the do-it-yourself versus acquiring and building on a platform, because these are the kind of technologies like agentic RAG that will become part of those platforms, right?
Right.
in the tool
And
set.
even, yeah, like if you look at Microsoft 365, they have the Microsoft Graph as a way of organizing all the information from your productivity and collaboration applications, so that when you can reason over it, if someone says, I want to look at the project plan of a particular project, it knows how to find everything that's related because it's spelled out explicitly in this graph, you know. And like in the case of Salesforce, their data cloud is going to it has unstructured information now, but they're going to turn that into a knowledge graph again, so that you can traverse the information much more explicitly, not the fuzzy search of an embedding alone. That's the downside of the. I'm having a senior moment here. I did, in my defense, when you just have a vector database, it's the equivalent of doing a vector search, but that works best when you can complement it with like a knowledge graph for the precision. One is sort of like explore, the other exploit.
Yeah, and it gives the agent the retrieval capabilities that better understand the context. They're able to understand relationships among different things better. They're able to, it's better
explicitly.
Yeah, aligned to some goal. So a really important sort of foundational technology, which over time, I think gets further enhanced by better and better, better and better reasoning, right? Capabilities that are starting to show up in the marketplace. Chain of thought is one of them. But I think this is going to go much further than that. And this is another good chart that I came up with here. And it kind of compares the notion of semantic reasoning and causal reasoning. So semantic reasoning, as I understand it, in the research I've done, is, like you said, it's based on knowledge graphs. And it's able to help, think about infusing this within the context of the RAG, the agentic RAG that we just talked about. But it understands a little bit more about intent and context, right? It's going to fetch more contextually aware data. It understands and shares semantic understanding within an agent in the different things it needs to deal with from a data perspective, but also among agents. It's just all about perception and coherence and understanding meaning of things, right? And that is the science of how AI is being applied around the knowledge graph. The next step on that is what many call a causal knowledge graph, which does all the same things. Think of it as, if semantic reasoning is not a high school, but a master's degree, causal reasoning is the PhD, right? It's the next level of sophistication that not only understands context and relationships and all that, but it actually understands the causal effects, the causal logic of what invokes what based on what, right? So all the dependencies become more cause and effect oriented, which is what really allows you to make judgments, right? Because a judgment is a function of understanding, cause and effect, and you need judgments to make decisions, right? And so it kind of takes it to a whole new level of sophistication. And it's really just a knowledge graph that actually has, causality or causal links between the entities. So what are your thoughts on this? I know we may be a couple years ahead of the curve here in terms of adoption rates, but I think you're going to see a lot of action on that left-hand side of this chart that will naturally grow over time into the right-hand side.
I think you're 100% right. I think this is part of a larger movement, which is as more and more knowledge of how the business work is learned by your data systems. You're basically you've always been setting up like analytics to answer the most basic questions about the business, which is what happened. But the next set of questions is around why. Why did something happen? Then it's, what's likely to happen and what should we do? And the reason I put that as part of the framework is today, the what happened is in a bunch of dashboards. But as you build out not just the data lake, but you build out a knowledge graph about at the first most basic level, it's like the metrics and dimensions in your BI tool that gives you, some structure around the data a little bit to find out a little bit more structure to find out why. It's in the diagnostic category, but that grows into a richer knowledge graph about how people, places, things, and activities in the business are related. And then, as you're saying, then a causal reasoning agent can essentially traverse that and try and make sense out of the data that's coming in and say, why did this happen? That's, goes beyond the dashboards.
Yeah. One of the participants in a previous podcast, Jaida Punatanda from Fitch Group, actually presented at a conference not too long ago, causal RAG. So it's, the next step here, right? And it does retrieval based on what it believes to be the causal inference of what would happen. It's, again, I think it's just, we're on this like maturing strategy or journey here that over time, and I think it's just a question of when all that comes about. But you take agentic RAG and you start over time infusing the semantics and the causal kind of stuff into it, the reasoning, super powerful compared to what you're able to do with a generative AI sort of task-oriented chatbot today or an assistant. Which kind of brings us to these levels of sophistication in terms of the type of agents that you can start to think about when you are building an agentic system or an architecture. I'm sure there are more, and George will get your thoughts on this, but this was just my take on some of the more foundational or key type of agents. So obviously you're going to need agents that are able to analyze and execute tasks, right? They identify patterns, they can detect anomalies. If they're hooked up to predictive models, they can do forecasts and predictions. They can create stuff. They can go off and execute or basically automate some task getting done. You're going to need those guys, right? Those kind of workers. You're going to need those that really understand the domain. Like if you're in a legal contracts department, you're going to need workers, digital workers that understand legality and contracts that are specific to the industry you're in and the country, the region, all that kind of stuff. And that's when you start getting into this notion of the semantics and the contextual knowledge, and very domain-specific LLM underpinnings. And then you got the agents that will help you reason, think through things, make better decisions, do some counterfactual thinking. What if I did this instead? And then, of course, you got the agents that are sort of like the managers, right? They gotta help you plan, and they're orchestrating how all these different agents talk to each other and work together, including humans. And it's got to be a journey over time, right? Because this is a lot of new potential sophistication. But what are your thoughts on this? Simple 4 levels of sophistication.
I think it's a really nice encapsulation and distillation, and we're mostly sort of in between 1 and 2, because 2, if you're adding domain knowledge, typically it's done by RAG today and naive RAG, not just chunking. And to do more sophisticated, I think people have done supervised fine tuning, and that's where you have like a bunch of labeled data sets labeled as in here's the information, here's like the answer, some pair where you can do supervised like training on it, and or potentially fine tuning on a data set beyond what something's been trained on. But we haven't done a lot of the reasoning and decisioning. That's like the deep research stuff is starting to get into that, where the vendors have shown that. But and that has a little bit of also planning and orchestration, not the orchestration, a little bit of the planning in it. Like, what's the plan I'm going to go generate to go find additional information as part of the deep research. But the orchestration is definitely, people are just beginning to introduce products around that now. That's more sophisticated.
Yeah. And I think when you get into the decision intelligence, the so-called reasoning and all that, I think a lot of it will start with the tools integration. Like, I'll be at the SaaS Innovate conference next week, and I'm sure that, they're a leader in, analytics, right? I'm sure there's They're going to be talking about ways to integrate analytics into these agents. And so it's not like a binary turn the switch off or on for it to be decision making or reasoning, but I think just the sophistication is very likely to grow in time here.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to, so one thing you've been talking a lot about, and I think you're 100% right, sort of the offensive line in football, which is, the harmonization layer, right? Your data, the semantic layer. I've heard some people maybe calling it as the cognitive core, right? And this is where the knowledge, the reasoning to some degree, the goal setting, it all converges, right? It's just a fascinating sort of advancement. Where do you see all this coming together? And I know you are, talk to us a little bit more about this harmonization layer, I guess is what I'm asking.
Okay, so to make it what I think is like a simplified analogy, like the agents are like the self-driving cars that we had in the desert 30 years ago. They could drive like 100 miles in the desert, but they were silos in the sense that they were not driving next to other self-driving cars or non-deterministic, pedestrians, non-deterministic as in like agents where you don't know exactly what they're going to do, or other non-deterministic human-driven cars. And we still 30 years later don't have pervasive autonomous driving technology as in agents on the road, because we don't have something like a digital four-dimensional map, something that tracks and predicts everyone's trajectory, because that would allow these self-driving cars to know where all the other agents are and what they're doing. And in the enterprise, we need something like that. To go back to that Disney example, something that shares the state of the wait time on all the rides. That's the equivalent. You can't coordinate everyone's experience unless there's a shared database to say, what is the wait time on all these different rides that I'm about to recommend you? That's the distinction and the common element.
And I think you get into the relationships and the semantics when, if there's the roller coaster has a short line, if all the agents say go there at the same time, then that short line's going to turn into, they all got to be.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the predict the trajectory part. You need to, everyone needs to essentially be able to execute a transaction and say, can I, add to the add this my client to the line, and if I do, what's the wait going to be? Because if 10,000 people, agents add their clients to the line, then the wait's going to be too long.
Yeah, and then that's where you kick in potentially the planning or orchestration agent, which is sort of like a manager or a decision maker.
Yes.
And, you can just go on. And there's probably an HR agent, or at least let's say tracks the metrics and the effectiveness of all these different agents. I mean, Marc said, and like Deloitte was saying, I mean, it starts over time to replicate or augment or mirror digital twin of real workers, real people doing stuff.
Exactly, because that's the learning loop where the agents representing each visitor have to learn. Did they match the preference of the visitor? Was their prediction about the wait time correct? All those models learn, and then your personal experience gets better over time, and then the overall effectiveness of the efficiency of the theme park's operation improves over time. That's the collective part.
So we have these emerging technologies that will build upon an LLM, generative AI predictive kind of foundation. And we showed 7 of them. We talked a little bit about the agentic RAG. We talked about the reasoning, decision intelligence stuff a little bit. And the semantic, harmonization layer. It kind of begs the question, or the importance, let's say it that way, of having a well thought out architecture, right? I mean, it's going to be multi-component, it's going to be multi-layered. You're going to have to be able to take these modular agents that have a job to do, and many of which can act autonomously, at least in communicating and talking with each other. So you're going to need a control plane, right? So what's your views? Just let's talk about architecture for a second, because you mentioned microservices as an analogy before. I mean, it seems to me if there's ever, like, architecture matters more than ever with this stuff compared to past technology.
Yeah. Well, this is why, there's like Y Combinator did this show, vertical agents are going to be like 10 times larger than SaaS. and SaaS has been, the story of enterprise software for the last 25 years. And I'm like, yes, but it's going to be vertical agents as part of a bigger framework. Like, look at the example of, go back to, do you remember Zynga? On Facebook. So this was like, it was a game. It was essentially a verticalization of Facebook. Facebook was a horizontal social graph. This was the vertical of entertainment and casual gaming within that. But they needed Facebook's platform to orchestrate the activity of all the members of the Farmville game, for instance. And so you couldn't do that without the data, because that social graph had the state of, it had everyone's relationship and the plumbing underneath, which is what everyone's doing. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, so Zynga had a bunch of agents, as in users, but they were orchestrated by this deterministic layer underneath. And they all essentially depended economically on the goodwill of Facebook. That's why I think that in this agent world, the vendor who controls the most, not just the data, but how to shape it into a 4D map, again, which is a 4D map is the people, processes, people, places, things, and activities of the business. We've always done snapshots of entities, people, places, things, and mostly we've stored them as strings, not things, meaning, semantically meaningful. But once you add the activities, that's everyone's moving about on the road or in the theme park, and that's really hard. And that's why I think much of the value is going to accrue to that layer, because we have hundreds and hundreds of semi-unicorn customer-facing agents and agent startups, and they all need the data and the state of the business that Salesforce has. To me, Salesforce is the new Facebook, at least for customer-facing data and processes.
Yeah, and that's where it's important to build off a lot of these technologies that are being enabled for you. And yeah, it's it definitely is heading towards a very different approach. And I think that's what, how you from last week was pointing out, that you got to rethink software from its core. It's just not the same as building like a SaaS app that we've been doing for the last, right? And it's different. It's not RPA either, correct? I mean, we're talking about.
Right. RPA was literally hard coding what the agent figures out on its own now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Very, very different, but incredibly powerful. And that's, again, why it's going to be a journey. Well, just if you recall, George, let me bring up this chart. We did a podcast, I think it was back in early February, the ladder to Agentic AI. You just want to make everyone aware, if you haven't watched that, you can go back and get our views on just the high level steps here. And the reason why this architecture just really matters. And, you start off with that foundational Gen AI, think of it as the gateway into AI. And then you have to build that domain knowledge around the use case and the workers that you're trying to add value to. You got to get the explainability and the decision intelligence in there. You got to enable these autonomous agents to be able to talk to each other and talk to different tools and different data sets and, all that. And then as you deploy these things, someone's going to be needing to orchestrate and govern the workflows that, as George just pointed out, are not static anymore. They're not hard coded. And then this whole thing learns from each other as time goes by here. So take Gen AI and LLMs, you build an ecosystem of models around that are unique to your business and that infuse these new capabilities. And then you get your agents, whether you build them yourself or you acquire them in the open market, and you wire those babies together into these workflows. And then it just adapts. It gets better as time goes by. What are you thinking there, George? Do you think that's still the roadmap ahead at a very high level?
Yeah.
Later.
I think, we're getting pretty good at deploying the domain knowledge in the models. But like you said, those more advanced steps are going to take some skills and some technology that it's not fully mature yet. But I do think the one thing I would add, when you're talking about like multi-agent systems, is that there needs to be a framework for them to get feedback from, and that it's the same framework where you set up to answer the questions about the business: what happened, why, what's likely to happen, and what should we do. Those become the metrics, and the tree of metrics becomes the model of how your business behaves, and just the way that's meant to give feedback to people about their performance and their goals, and how it ties into the bigger corporate performance as that metric tree becomes live, not just hard-coded rules. Then the agents, the agent that's helping the customer service department, or trying to autonomously help a customer in customer service, can say, I want to make sure I'm responding that within the parameters of the customer satisfaction goals, but I also want to respect the overall corporate profitability goals. I don't want to do something that's going to tank, that costs so much that in other words, you set up this model of corporate performance that's reflected in metrics, and that becomes a way to teach agents how to perform.
Right. And then they optimize against those metrics. And then, yeah, it's a very different world. So before we wrap up here, George, I'm sure a lot in our audience are just getting started with this, trying to understand what this is all about. What would be your advice be for the first step they should take here? Just to kind of, how do I get started?
Okay. I think it depends then on who you are. If you're frankly, if you're just getting started now, you're probably like a mainstream corporate, developer, or data engineer or business analyst. You're not in a tech-centric company, because they're putting the pieces together themselves. So if you're in a mainstream shop, I would look at your current platform providers, whether it's your enterprise application vendors, whether Oracle, or Salesforce or SAP, and essentially they're going to have agents built into the apps that augment and automate some of the tasks or workflows or processes that are already in that app. But here you're still just reinforcing the silos that are already there, but that's okay. You're having scoped productivity improvement. I think the next step would be with your analytic data foundation. You're going to have agents for helping the data engineers build pipelines. You're going to have agents. You can already find these from your data platform vendors. Agents for your data scientists working in the notebooks to help them with feature engineering and experiments. And you would have agents within your business intelligence now for your essentially business analysts, or for your end users to be able to talk to the data. So there's many different angles. We haven't brought them all together yet. They would all be today augmentations of your existing systems.
Right. You got to build from what you have.
Yeah.
All right, George. This has been a great conversation here. Very informative, very meaningful, I think. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here.
Always fun to join you, Scott.
Yeah, we'll keep doing these. It's great. And for all of you, I hope you found this conversation insightful. I certainly did. There's no doubt that we're entering the golden age of AI agents, a total reset on how software is designed, built, and used, and perhaps the biggest since the e-business days 25 years ago with the advent of the internet. It really is a big change. And this opportunity, as George was just pointing out, is no longer theoretical. It's real. It's growing. It's available to those with the clarity of vision and the urgency to get going and act. So one thing you can also do is make sure you check out the AI Agent Builder Summit that we just held with 20 industry pioneers. You can find that on thecube.net or out on our YouTube channel. Also, make sure, again, you go watch the interview that Dave Vellante and George did with Salesforce, Marc Benioff. Again, really, really good, insightful conversation that I highly recommend. So anyhow, thank you for tuning in. Take care. We'll see you on the next episode of the Next Frontiers of AI. We are the leader in tech news and analysis. See you for next time around. Bye, all.